Do you trust utopian visionaries or dystopian visionaries more? Like, if you had to pick a leader from a hat, which hat would you pick from? And there's this problem because on one hand, we need positive visions of the future. The system is going to evolve and it will evolve no matter what, and something has to be envisioned for us to evolve into it. On the other hand, utopian visions tend to be pretty creepy. And I think there is a gut wisdom behind this ick reaction to these utopias. Like, oftentimes the people in the utopias do not feel like real people. They feel like the utopians' puppets. But here's the problem. If we throw out the exercise of generating utopian visions, then we give a leg up to these creepy utopians to shape the future according to their design. Because our system is evolving. It can't not evolve. And I think it's evolving more quickly now than ever. And the question is, whose hopes and dreams do we want to drive that evolution? So we need to do this. This is an exercise that needs to happen among the general population. But how do we do that without becoming the monster? And I believe the first step here needs to be listening to the gut wisdom that's telling us utopian visions are creepy. Why is that? That's the task of this video. I want to start out by talking a little bit about this book, Walden Two by B.F. Skinner. B.F. Skinner was the scientist who was really into behavioral engineering. He was into positive and negative reinforcement to control and direct the behavior of animals in his lab. And this is actually the book that she talks about in her book that I reviewed recently. Now, the book is a fictional account of basically this professor who gets invited to go see Frasier's Utopia, where Frasier is the designer of the utopia who uses behavioral engineering to use positive and negative reinforcement to just create the perfect society. And the class of people that gets to do the pulling of the strings and the design of the environment is sort of this management class that's all cooperative among themselves. There's no competition. And through all this behavioral engineering and design of their environment, Frasier is able to create a class of people who doesn't get angry and doesn't get envious, and the babies there don't cry. And why don't the babies cry in this Walden Two, this utopian subsect of society? The babies don't cry because their temperature is perfectly controlled. People's food is controlled, so they're perfectly healthy. When parents give birth to a child, that child is handed over to be raised in this environment where everything is set up and designed to move the child through these different stages, to train out of them all of that bad stuff. So yes, the population there is super spiritually enlightened as a result of behavioral engineering. And the book is basically this professor going into this utopia and being like, well, what about this? And Frasier, the utopian designer, is basically like, oh, we have an answer to that. We can answer all of your objections. We've thought everything through. And it gets pretty over the top. Like, there's a section at the end where the professor is like, aren't you playing God? Isn't that what's going on? And Frasier is like, well, I consider Jesus to be a colleague. It's just that I'm better at the job than Jesus is. In fact, at the end of this video, I'm just going to give you some quotes of him comparing himself with God, and those quotes I think will speak for themselves. Now, of course, if he's going to compare himself to God and Jesus, he needs a definition of love, right? And he gives such a definition, so let's hear it. What is love? Frasier said with a shrug, except another name for the use of positive reinforcement. Now, what is wrong with that definition of love? And how does this play in with our understanding of utopias? We will return to this definition of love in a few minutes because I do think it will help us to understand creepy utopias. But for now, we just want to ask what makes his vision of utopia so creepy, and how can that help us understand why utopias so easily slip into the creepy territory? And one answer here is that the people inside these utopias oftentimes do not feel like real human beings. They feel like puppets or zombies or something like that. So the question is there something inherent in the task of envisioning utopias that leads to zombie-like, puppet-like inhabitants? And I think the answer is at least partially yes. In which case, what exactly is this task of utopian visionaries? And I would say their task is envisioning new institutions. Like if our existing institutions are degrading and crumbling in some ways, what is a healthier version of institutions? We need to envision that before we can move into something. But if we're going to do that, and if we're going to understand why that task sometimes gravitates towards something creepy, we first need to know what is an institution and what are institutions in his book. An institution is a set of rules, roles, norms, expectations, and enforcement mechanisms that structure human relationship. And institutions can be official, in other words, written down and enforced with official roles of people who are supposed to enforce them, or they can be institutions of the heart, which are sort of enforced through social norms, through judgment that happens naturally, through accolades, what gets positive reinforcement through the natural goings about of a community. Both of those are institutions, and actually usually you kind of need both of those to work together. And like almost all utopian visions, Skinner's Walden Two has both official institutions and also institutions of the heart, where the official institutions here are you have this management class that does the nudging and that does the conditioning of people to make sure as they grow up, all of the bad stuff is conditioned out of them through reinforcement mechanisms. You have that management class, but you also have sort of social norms, and some of the social norms are you don't talk bad about the management class. If you have an issue or a problem with the way they're doing things, you report to your management, you report to the hierarchical structure rather than gossiping behind their backs. So that's a social institution that's upheld socially in his little vision. And institutions, I should say, include things like marriage and the different roles of mother and father, husband and wife, what is expected from each of these roles. And he's redefining those roles where the parents, once they have the baby, they eventually sort of hand the baby over to the management class to move through the system in a way that's controlling the baby's environment and their social setting. So once the women have given birth to these children, they sort of hand things over to the state and go off and do their own thing. That's him designing new institutions. The management class in his vision controls everybody's food perfectly. They run little experiments to figure out which way of managing people works better, and everybody in this environment is just sort of lab rats that just accept this kind of institutional structure. And that, for me, is why these people feel like puppets. Would people just be totally fine with somebody else controlling their food? They know those managers are doing everything for their best interest, totally fine being experimented on. They know it's for the community's best interest, and they're just self-sacrificing to be lab rats. And when I try to put my finger on what is the problem here, my biggest issue is that the people inside this environment, this Walden Two utopia, they're not interested in participating in the development and the evolution of the institutions they're part of. They're just happy to hand that over to somebody else and let those other people be the ones to design the institutions. That, to me, is not human. Institution building is a natural part of human nature. If you listen to 7-year-olds on the playground, they're constantly negotiating the rules of the games they're playing. Like they're playing Foursquare and they'll say things like, let's say you can't go past the fence, and if you hit it over the fence, then you lose 5 points. They're constantly engaging in practicing designing and developing and evolving institutions. And institutions essentially constantly evolve on top of the intuitions and the desires of the people inside of them. And Skinner might say, oh, these people in my environment actually can participate in the design of their institutions by reporting to their manager. But I don't think that's enough. I think being inside the institutional structure where you take the only way you can actually participate is through your manager as fixed and just you accept it, that doesn't feel like real humans to me. So relating this to utopia, building utopian visions is an exercise in designing new institutions. And that is going to have to involve both official institutions, which are a little bit more mechanistic, and also institutions of the heart. And yet, how do we engage in this task without becoming the monster, without becoming creepy ourselves? So what does it look like to evolve institutions? And how does that relate to utopias? And to answer that question, we're going to turn to Elinor Ostrom's book, Governing the Commons. The subtitle is The Evolution of Institutions for Collective Action. She's one of the most important thinkers in this space. And she points out that there are different layers of institutions. It's not just about the rules that govern a community. Institutions also need to have rules about how you change the rules. Do you need a vote to change the rules? Can some governor just come in and decide to change the rules by themselves? Is there a board of directors? Do you need consensus of some kind among the community? How often do you revisit the rules and look for updates that are needed? All of these are questions that functional institutions need to wrestle with. And one thing she and others point out is that institutions have to be upheld by the entire community and enforced by the entire community. In other words, there needs to be alignment between the official rules, the official institutions, and the institutions of the heart, what people are trying to enforce. And the way that alignment often takes place is that people need to have ownership over the institutions they live within. And if they don't have ownership, there will be resistance, there will be resentment, there will be subtle acts of defying the rules if people don't feel like they have a way of engaging with and collectively determining the rules. And institutions of the heart, of course, can evolve over the water cooler and through gossip. And if there is sort of an oppressive leader, that leader is going to experience gossip behind their back because people's frustration just bubbles out through the institutions of the heart. And it will become harder and harder for them to govern, for them to impose their rules. So what this means for the utopian visionaries is essentially there needs to be ways for the institutions that the utopian visionary is designing to evolve and change according to the needs of the community, to hand over ownership of that utopian vision to the people who actually inhabit it. And the ironic thing about that is that means any utopian vision needs to have built within it the seeds of its own destruction. And certainly the seeds of the destruction of the part of that vision that will not actually work out in practice, because nobody's vision can be perfect. And one way that utopian visions can get creepy is if they trap their subjects inside this world that they cannot escape. But we're not yet to the bottom of the question, why are utopian visions so frequently creepy? And to answer this, I want to turn to this book that I talk about a lot, The Matter with Things by Iain McGilchrist. McGilchrist is a polymath who pulls together neuroscience and philosophy and physics and religion and biology and his experience as a medical doctor. And he pulls these together in order to propose a paradigm shift in the way we think. And this paradigm shift relates to the different ways that the left and the right hemispheres of the brain perceive the world. And in particular, in doing this, he makes a diagnosis of what is the matter with things, what is wrong in society, which he relates to the brain hemispheres and the way the modern world tends to perceive the world through the left hemisphere lens of looking at the world. Whereas he says, actually, that's going to cause delusion. It's going to make it feel like we live inside a delusional system. It's going to cause it to feel like we live inside a machine, a sort of administrative mechanistic machine that doesn't care about human beings. And in some ways, in many ways, this paradigm shift is really about switching to a more right hemisphere dominant way of seeing the world, which is healthier. In fact, his thesis relates to making the right hemisphere the master and the left hemisphere the emissary, that's the appropriate relationship between the two hemispheres when we perceive the world in accordance with human values and flourishing and life on this planet. So if we're thinking about different utopian visionaries, what is a left hemisphere dominant way of envisioning institutions of the future, and what's a more right hemisphere way of perceiving the possibilities? And for us to understand this, I need to lay out the basics of the difference between left hemisphere and right hemisphere thinking. And once I've done that, we'll return to this question of why do utopias so frequently gravitate toward the creepy? And as I go through the basics on the brain hemisphere differences, be thinking about Skinner's version of utopia and Skinner's definition of love. Love is positive reinforcement. What's the problem with that? And the difference in the hemispheres is not about about what they're doing, but it's about the way that they perceive the world. The left hemisphere is oriented toward power and apprehending, whereas the right hemisphere is oriented toward understanding the world and being in right relationship with the world. In designing utopias, if you're restructuring society in your little exercise of envisioning new worlds, is that inherently an act of power and apprehending? Or could there be a way of doing that that's really about being in right relationship with the world? And if so, what would those look like? How would they be different? The left hemisphere is in charge of building maps of the world that help us to navigate it, whereas the right hemisphere can perceive the territory, and it can perceive things about the world that violate our preconceived notion. A utopian vision is actually kind of a map. So the question is, can a utopian visionary contend with that which does not fall within its map? Because that's a task that the left hemisphere has trouble with sometimes. The left hemisphere dismisses information that doesn't fit within its model and that doesn't fall under its control. It says that's not real if it doesn't conform to its preconceived notion, whereas the right hemisphere is able to leave space for that which will not come under a person's direct control. The left hemisphere is more arrogant and it cannot handle uncertainty well, whereas the right hemisphere is much more humble. It's much better at dealing with uncertainty, at holding two contradictory things that might both be true at the same time. The emotions of the left hemisphere are happiness, which you might imagine arrogance goes with happiness, but also anger and disgust, because of course anger and disgust are both associated with exerting power in the world, whereas the right hemisphere is better at other kinds of emotions, apprehension, ambiguous emotions, the complexity of emotions. The right hemisphere is good at sort of reading the room, reading people's intentions based on things that are read between the lines of what they say. The left hemisphere uses a machine analogy and thinks of things like an engineer engineering the machine. Everything falls under the control of the engineer. Whereas the right hemisphere, it's more like a garden. Anything you're doing has a reciprocal relationship between you and that which you're trying to cultivate, where the plants themselves have their own will in the garden, and part of gardening involves attending to their will apart from what you would want. The two hemispheres perceive value differently from one another. The left hemisphere perceives value as that which is useful for me. It's using others as a means to an end you desire. The right hemisphere, on the other hand, views value as inherent in the world. A person is inherently valuable. A forest is inherently valuable. And value is not about using that, but about perceiving that real value and being in right relationship with it. Immanuel Kant is the one to lay out an ethical philosophy that says we need to treat people as ends in and of themselves, not as means to an end. And this doesn't mean that you ever interact with somebody as if you need to use that person in some way. Like if you're interacting at a store with the clerk at the store, that person is a means for you purchasing whatever you're purchasing. But first and foremost, before that, you're treating them as a human being of value, as a person, where the interaction with the person and their sort of sacredness, their value as a person, comes before them as a means to something you want. The left hemisphere engages in either or thinking. The right hemisphere engages in both and thinking. The left hemisphere decontextualizes things and sort of isolates things from their context, whereas the right hemisphere perceives things as part of a bigger whole, with lots of intricate interconnections where you cannot isolate any one given thing from its context. So with all of that, how would you classify Skinner's definition of love as being positive reinforcement? Love as being that which falls under your control in terms of what's going on between you and another person. And of course, part of what he's saying here is the most important things in life, like love and meaning and purpose and beauty. These are things that will not fall under your thumb. They will not come under direct direct control of you. They require being okay with a back and forth of something which has its own will and its own desires and its own reality that will not respond to your attempts to control. And his critique of modern society is that it has taken on a left hemisphere dominant way of operating in the world. In which case, how does the left hemisphere, right hemisphere framework help us to understand what's wrong with Skinner's utopia? And of course, this is in the bigger picture of what's wrong with utopias more generally. Why do they fall off course so easily? And to answer this, I'd like to zoom into the two aspects of Skinner's world that bothered me the most. The first of these is going to be the notion that babies don't cry in Walden Two, and they don't cry because their temperature is perfectly controlled. That comes across completely delusional. And the style of delusion of that is a very left hemisphere way of thinking, style of delusion. But I also think there's a pathway of utopian thinking that will lead people somewhat naturally to this style of thought. And that is the problem-solution framework. Now, he does not say this, but I would characterize problem-solution thinking as left hemisphere thinking, which does not mean that it's wrong. As a matter of fact, problem-solution thinking is incredibly necessary. But the thing is, it's devoid of context. It sort of isolates a particular problem from its context. It solves that problem and resolves it without thinking about, wait a second, every solution might bring its own problems when you actually embed it in a bigger context where there can be side effects and secondary side effects and third side effects and all of that. So while the left hemisphere simplifies things into problems that can be solved, the right hemisphere can perceive the whole, and the right hemisphere knows that there is no such thing as a one and done solution. So Skinner is bringing a problem solution mind to babies crying. Why do babies cry? Their temperature is off base. Solve the problem with perfect temperature control. One and done. There's nothing left to do. And I'm imagining this conversation between parents and Skinner, where the parents are like, excuse me, controlling the temperature. No, that's not why babies cry. And Skinner is like, well, then what would you say causes babies to cry? And the parents might say something like, well, it's different every time. Sometimes it's temperature, sometimes it's a stomach ache, sometimes they just need a little love, sometimes they're afraid of a person that's in the room that they don't know or understand. It's different every time. And Skinner's response to that, if I'm imagining a left hemisphere style of response, might be, oh, we'll get rid of the stomach aches by controlling the food they intake. We'll sort of measure everything about their physiology and just get rid of anything that causes a stomach ache. So if your approach is to just ramp up the problem solution framework and just add more solutions, add more experimentation and adjustment and controlling and titrating the environment, then you can solve the problem of babies crying according to a left hemisphere frame of mind. If the baby is still crying, you just don't have enough data, you don't have enough control, ramp up the control and you'll control out all of the pain. Now, I've claimed that the problem solution framework around babies crying is a left hemisphere phenomenon. But one thing I love about this book is he does not throw out the left hemisphere. He doesn't say it's all bad, we just need to get rid of everything that's left hemisphere. No, you actually need the left hemisphere. It just needs to be in right relationship with the right hemisphere, which is the master. The left hemisphere is the emissary in his thesis. So there actually is a place for the problem solution framework around babies crying. And that place is the parent in the specific moment when the baby is crying. At that point, they need to be the problem solver. They need to sort of isolate the incident and say, what's going on with my baby right now? What can I do? What can I do as I exert power in the world to fix this baby's situation? They have to figure out, is it the stomach ache? Is it the fear of the neighbor who's in the room? What is it? That is an appropriate use of the left hemisphere. But one of the themes of this channel is the notion of zooming in and zooming out to look at things from different perspectives. So when we look at this problem from the perspective of the parent in the specific moment, problem solution is absolutely appropriate. But when we zoom back to look at the whole problem of babies crying, the situation changes. From a zoomed back perspective, why do babies cry? And of course they cry to sort of get the attention of their mother, to create a certain kind of connection with their mother, to call forth the mother's problem-solving skills. But we could also think of it as there's sort of hills and valleys in life. There's ups and downs, there's joys, and there's pains and sorrows. And when the baby cries, that's an indication that they're in a moment of pain, and it's their way that they call forth this connection with their mother, with their father, with their parent. And that connection in and of itself, when that happens, when that little problem-solving, loving the baby in that moment thing happens, in many ways, this is sort of teaching the child, how do you deal with valleys? The kind of connection between people that happens in the valleys of life. That's a connection that cannot happen in the peaks, that cannot happen in the moments of joy. And yet it is an integral part of love and what actually makes the fabric of life worthwhile. In fact, you can't get rid of the valleys without also getting rid of the mountains. And in trying to engineer out all of the pain, engineer out all of the bad, you end up throwing out the good as well. To the left hemisphere of the brain, that is a contradiction. You need the low times, the pain, the bad times in order to have the high times. That doesn't make sense in a framework that sort of fits everything into an either good or bad binary. And yet it's that zoomed back paradoxical perspective that helps us to understand engineering out babies crying is engineering out something essential. Now, the second thing from this book that bothered me, and actually this one bothered me I think even more than the babies crying thing, is the notion that the behavioral engineering from these technocrats has engineered out anger and jealousy. He's taken these bad things that humans experience and just figured out, how do you make sure people don't grow up with any of that bad stuff? And in some ways, this gets at the heart of something I've seen in other utopian visions as well, which is that you have these high-level institutions that these utopians are designing. And as a result of the high-level institutions, you have super spiritually enlightened subjects. And that's why they don't feel real. That's why they feel like the puppets that they show up as in these narratives. And this actually goes so deep that I need to move most of the discussion of this to another video. But I just want to set it up so that you can be mulling it over between now and when I post that video, because I don't have all of the answers, and in many ways the task for me is raising the questions and giving enough background for people to understand the questions and mull these things over on their own. When I encounter any utopian thinker who has this thing of the high-level institutions causing virtuous subjects, spiritually enlightened subjects, my first reaction is oftentimes, can you please just not do that? If your subjects were that spiritually enlightened and perfect, they actually would not need your institutions to begin with. And oftentimes it's just this non sequitur. How do you get from that specific mechanistic institution to spiritually enlightened people? And the causal pathway, even the causal influence, is just not explained. So on one hand, it drives me bananas. On the other hand, can you actually have any functional system without people in it who are honest and kind and courageous and diligent and attentive and who just have integrity? Can you have a system in place that doesn't have people like that in key roles? And the answer is probably no. You can't have people who are only selfish and a system that's functional. The other problem here is that there is actually a relationship between institutions and virtue. In many ways, people can individually cultivate virtue, but it's easier to cultivate virtue in communities. And anytime you have a community oriented around a set of values, that is going to come with institutions in that community. So I can't entirely just tell utopian visionaries, stop doing that thing with spiritually enlightened subjects. As a matter of fact, freedom of religion in the Old Enlightenment was a high-level institution. It was a concept that was intended to be enforced through the laws and regulations and enforced culturally. And that value, I think, was intended to cultivate spiritual virtues. And yet it is so easy for these visions that build in virtue to become cult-like. So how do we make sense of all of this? That's all I have for today, but I did promise that I would read you a quote from this book of Fraser, the fictional designer of Skinner's Utopia, comparing himself to God. Just so you don't think you're God, I said hesitantly, hoping to bring matters into the open. And that's the professor speaking. There's a curious similarity, he said. Rather considerably less control in your case, I should imagine, I said. Not at all, he said, at least if we can believe the theologians. On the contrary, it's the other way around. You may remember that God's children are always disappointing him. So yeah, I admit that quote was a bit gratuitous, but if you're going to put a utopian vision out there into the world, you have to be aware that somebody on the internet might read your words out loud exactly the way you wrote them. If you want a deeper dive into McGilchrist's work, I will link here to a video where I cover that in more depth.